This is where things would
And she
land at
shouldn't
the end
be
of
there. She
election
got
night.
no
Donald
votes.
Trump,
She shouldn't be
over
there.
270 electoral.
Eating the dogs, the
Leaving
people
his
that came
rallies
in,
early.
they're eating the
United
country.
States, I will
Probably 20 million
sign
people.
it into law.
Who the hell do I actually vote for? In this video, I'm going to try to explain a blueprint that will help you decide who to vote for not only in this election, but in every election for the rest of your life. The foundation for this blueprint is, how do you bring about change? Every 4 years, you have somebody come into office or come onto the political stage and say, oh, I'm going to change things. Even if they have been in office for 4 years, they will say, oh, I'm going to change things. So how does that actually happen? Why does it feel like every 4 years we'll fill in the little bubble because we want change, but change doesn't actually happen? When you think about change and look at it from a historical point of view, it comes about in one of two ways, pretty much. The first blueprint to change is what I like to call like the march or the movement, right? It's people who organize and spend often decades just trying to inch towards their goal. This is how the suffragette movement brought about change. This is how the civil rights movement brought about change. This is how the conservative legal movement brought about change. The second strategy is revolution. Overthrow the people in charge, burn this shit to the ground, and let's start over. That is how the Haitian slave revolution worked. That is how the French Revolution worked. That's how our own revolution worked in 1776. So which one do we do now? When considering this question, it's pretty privileged to say that we should do a revolution here in the United States. Because when you look at a bunch of those historic examples of revolution, it was their only option. Slaves in Haiti had no bodily autonomy. They were literally property. In 1776, the colonies were just at the whims of a monarch. Whatever the fucking king said, that's what you have to do. Shut up, stop complaining, you want representation? Eat shit, nerd. Like, there was no other option than to overthrow and burn shit to the ground. Whereas here in the United States, we do have a functioning democracy. Notice I say functioning. It's not perfect. There are a lot of problems, from voter suppression, the electoral college, gerrymandering, money in politics. Like, there are a lot of problems with it, but I would argue that it's functional given the fact that we can go from a Bill Clinton to a George Bush to an Obama to a Trump. Like, the fact that the political landscape can sway so vigorously shows that you are capable of lobbying and organizing and strategizing to try to influence the change that you want. Democracy in America does work. It's not perfect, but it is functional. Okay, so revolution with a capital R is more of a break in case of emergency kind of a tool. And I would argue that we aren't quite there yet in America, which means that we're left with this other strategy, right? The movement, marching, mobilizing. And you might be skeptical and say, yeah, okay, maybe that worked in the past, but there's no way it works now. Things are just too different. And I shared this level of skepticism. That was until I learned about a group of people who is using this strategy, and it's working insanely well. They are the conservative legal movement. You see, back in 1973, when Roe v. Wade was first decided, a bunch of people disagreed with that decision and they decided to fight it, but not physically. Instead, they pooled their money together as well as their brain power and came up with a strategy to try to overturn that Supreme Court decision. They created legal networks like the Federalist Society, which came up with an interpretation of the Constitution that could potentially be used to overturn Roe v. Wade. And then they built out a network of judges and scholars to teach and embed that interpretation of the Constitution in the legal system, choosing key cases after key cases that could chip away at the precedents of Roe. The movement also created foundations and think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, which drafted and thought up anti-abortion legislation promoting it all across the country. Things like heartbeat bills and bounty hunter laws. Perhaps one of the most important tools in their toolbox was a running list of potential nominees for the Supreme Court that, if they had the chance to nominate, would help them overturn Roe v. Wade. This movement started back in the 70s. Roe was decided in 73, so it's been 50 years of playing this game of chess, laying this groundwork and setting up these dominoes in hopes that one day it would all pay off. And when you look more specifically at the core principle of the strategy that they used, it was kind of this economic model for change, an almost compound interest on small victories. Say this glass represents your bank account of change. Compound interest pretty much has two levers to it: the amount of money you invest or the amount of time you're willing to wait. Let's say I only invest $100 every year into my bank account of change. With a 4% interest rate, it would take me about 150 years to reach $1 million. If I, for example, invested $100,000, it would take about 8 years. The more I'm able to invest, the less time I have to wait. However, I don't have $100,000. All I have is $100. I should still invest that $100 because if the bank account is zero, if it's empty, there's no way for money to accrue. Another important thing to consider is that maybe next year I can invest more than $100 and trim down that 150-year timeline. This was kind of the approach for a lot of these different social movements. They tried to make the biggest possible investment in their bank account of change that they could. Sometimes it was a $100,000 investment that represented a big change or a big victory for their cause. For the conservative legal movement, for example, that can be represented by electing Ronald Reagan. But other times they could only afford to make a $100 investment in their bank account. They had to settle for a small victory, which might come across as like getting one state representative elected to help potentially push forward anti-abortion legislation in that state. A lot of times they had to make compromises. There were a lot of times where a Republican nominee for president didn't have the same stance on Roe that they had. And in those situations, rather than abstaining from voting or writing in the name of some pro-life nut, they would still support that Republican nominee for president in hopes that they would be able to lobby them and get them to flip their stance. And a lot of times they were successful. In the instances where they couldn't get that person to change their mind, well then what they were doing on the background was they were getting a different candidate ready to primary them come next cycle. The key to making this strategy work is trying to make the biggest possible deposit you can at any given moment. Sometimes it might be huge, sometimes it might be small, but still make that deposit. One of the most remarkable parts about the conservative legal movement was the fact that they were patient. They made as big an investment as they could, but they were also willing to wait 150 years if it took that long. Here's a reverend who played a key role in the conservative legal movement to try to overturn Roe v. Wade and ban all abortion in this country, predicting how long he thought it would take to actually do it.
For me, of about 35 years of work, I don't think we have 5 votes on Roe v. Wade. I think we're probably 1 or 2 votes short. I think we're 50 years away. We've got to just stay with it, stay with it, stay with it.
This movement didn't just concern itself with trying to win the presidency every 4 years. They huddled together and tried to figure out every small victory that they could possibly have, including things like congressional seats up for grabs every 2 years, things like governorships, things like attorney general positions, town clerkhoods, mayors. Nothing was too small for them to consider. These people spent 50 years, hundreds of millions of dollars playing this game of chess. Was it worth it? What did they actually get? And the answer is like a lot. Let's take a second and consider what might happen if Donald Trump wins this election. Supreme Court Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito will most likely retire, meaning that Donald Trump will get to appoint 2 more judges to the court who will be recommended by the conservative legal movement. Fun fact, Clarence Thomas, as well as all of Trump's prior appointees, were all recommended by this movement. If this were to go through, that means that 5 out of 9 of the Supreme Court justices would have been selected by one president and this one movement. Think about that for a second. The prize for playing this 50-year chess game is complete control over an entire branch of government, completely undermining the Founding Fathers' idea of separation of powers and checks and balances. That's a pretty remarkable prize to win, and the way that they did it was by using this model of compound interest on victories, no matter how small or how large. But this video is about voting. It's not about the Supreme Court or this movement of people. So why am I talking about this? In the political climate that we have today, it can feel incredibly overwhelming and depressing, as if there's nothing that you can do. Perhaps counterintuitively, I actually look to the conservative legal movement with a kind of beacon of hope. Because it's important to recognize that this movement, this group of people, is a minority of the country. 60% of America thinks that Roe was a good precedent and they want it reinstated. And so if a group of people that is in the minority and also includes some of the dumbest people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, if that group of people can organize and use this playbook to potentially achieve something as monumental as complete control of an entire branch of government, what gives me hope is the fact that there is no reason then why you or I can't use that exact same strategy to achieve an even more monumental change. At the beginning of this video, I told you that I was going to give you a blueprint on how to vote in 2024, but also for every election for the rest of your life. And that blueprint, that playbook, just says that you should vote for whoever can win and whoever represents a deposit into your bank account of change, no matter how small. It's really easy to get disappointed and disheartened by the fact that this deposit you're making could have been bigger. This deposit that you're making doesn't feel substantial enough. But you can't let that stop you from making it anyways. Because history and math shows us that small incremental change over a long period of time can be remarkable. For me, this means voting for Kamala Harris. She by no means represents a $100,000 deposit into my bank account of change, but she also isn't a withdrawal. A perspective that I've personally found very helpful to beat back the creeping sense of nihilism that comes with each one of these elections is to not view them as a lesser of two evils, but rather to ask myself who is a step forward as opposed to a step backwards. Back when Biden was dropping out of the race to make way for Kamala, he referred to himself as a transitional president. The reality of the situation, though, is that every president is a transitional one. No one president is given a magic wand that just lets them fix every problem and change everything. That's not how our government was designed. This playbook, this blueprint tells me that I should work to try to get her elected. But if she is elected, not to just pack up and go home, but rather continue to push her to change her stance on views that I disagree with, all while trying to help build up candidates who can primary her in the future. This strategy, this blueprint, is what's being used by most major lobbying organizations and rich people in this country. Groups like AIPAC have been using this strategy and executing it perfectly for decades. I gain a lot of inspiration looking at organizations like Leaders We Deserve, who are digging their heels in and getting ready to play the next 50 years of this chess game to try to swing things back in the favor of progressive values. At the end of the day, America is still a functioning democracy. And if the majority of Americans agree on things like a woman's right to choose and that climate change is real, the only way for this geriatric group of out-of-touch people to win is for them to spend as much money as they can to convince you and I to not vote. That's why they'll spend millions and billions of dollars on advertising to try to change people's minds, or to push forward legislation that makes it harder for people to vote, or to flood our feeds with news and consumerism that just gets us to just check out. Simply put, they don't have the votes. The only way they win is if you and I don't show up. And that gives me confidence. And armed with that confidence and this strategy that I know works, I'm ready to go push back on a bunch of people who I know don't represent the majority of American values.